Okay, welcome to another economics lesson with someone that doesn't know anything about economics. I don't know, I'm trying to learn more. Again, I'm a big fan of Thomas Sowell, so I'll get a lot of information from him. I'll try to put a link for that. But yeah, I'm going to talk about the wage gap, or whatever name you give it. In particular, so the gender wage gap. It's so, the statistics make it very clear. Women earn less than men on average, okay? But you'll get different figures in different places. That's not surprising. What's, I think, not as correct is to jump to the conclusion of exactly why, when it may be a number of factors, and we can break them down. We can actually analyze it. So, for example, a lot of people will think it's due to discrimination. Maybe there's a patriarchy or something, whatever, but the employers are discriminating against female employees. So I want to look at it a few ways. So thing number one is if you've got that big difference, women earning, say, let's just say 70 cents for every dollar that a man earns, there's so many other factors to look at. So for instance, what types of jobs do men and women tend to go into? There could just be patterns that women prefer certain types of jobs. The biggest thing actually is childbirth. Women, inevitably some women are going to have children, and they typically can't work at that time, or they'll choose not to, maybe for a few years to bring up children. It's a pattern. It's not necessarily a good or bad thing, but it's a very common pattern. And as a result, especially these days where there's so much skill involved in work and experience, you're at a huge disadvantage if you take time off work. So if you start breaking down the statistics, which you have to do, by the way, just in science, if you want to establish a cause and effect or a relationship between two things, you have to control all the other variables, and there are so many variables that aren't being controlled here. So for example, if I can get to the essence of it, is that if you take women who have never been married for say 20 years and men who have never been married continuously working for 20 years, the wage gap practically seems to disappear, or it becomes substantially smaller than what it is when you look at the gross, structure of society. And in fact, in some cases, I've heard women earn more than men in certain areas, so I don't see a problem. Another thing, so you've got women having children. The other thing is women often will know at some point that they might have children. It's going to be less appealing for them to pick certain types of jobs. They're more likely to pick jobs that might have a certain set number of hours, as opposed to jobs where there's often going to be overtime or, other sorts of, they might have to work at night or day. These are factors that can affect their choices, and it's so simple. Some other little things to keep in mind. There are some jobs that are very dangerous or hazardous. Some jobs that require lots of, that are labor intensive. Physical strength is required. And as for whatever reason, men tend to do that much more often than women. Any kind of hazardous job tends to pay extra because of those hazards. Keep in mind the life expectancy is higher for women, probably because of, it seems obvious, it's because of those jobs, and like mining, construction, things like that, which are, again, if you look at statistics, dominated by men, and because of that hazard, may be paid a bit more. So there are other things that are interesting to consider. Married couples are often going to make decisions based on their total income together, right? So if the man is earning a lot more than the woman for whatever reason, they might even decide to move to a place to really help promote his career at the expense of the woman's career. She might want to work a lot as well and have a successful career, but she has to, again, this is just a structure that exists. Women often will end up looking after children, taking more time off work. It should be considered some women who are really keen on a certain career may choose not to have children, or may choose to forego having children for a while until they're older, and they tend to do quite well, like in terms of earning money and being equal to men in that regard. In these cases where they move to a place that might benefit the man's career at the expense of the woman's career, and again, that's going to add to the statistics. There may be cases where it goes the other way around, and the couple go to a place to benefit the woman's career, and the man's not, just gets sort of another random job, part-time or whatever, and it's centered around the woman, but that's going to be less common. In both cases, though, one of the partners, it's a specific agreement within the marriage to benefit the family as a whole. There's no point trying to equalize their incomes if they can maximize their total income by focusing on the person who has the better chance of getting a really big career in a certain, or good progress in a certain place. And then they're compensated for that in the case of a divorce. It makes sense that the only thing I think is there's a comedian, Bill Burr, and he's pointed out, in cases where, like a really famous basketball player or golfer or some sports person gets a divorce for whatever reason, whatever the reasons are, and then the woman who was married to them ends up getting 50%, like it's just 50%. And I think that can be a bit dodgy. Like, even if you think they earn too much money, it should be based on what the woman sacrificed, what she would have been earning had she been single. Or in the case of the other way around, if the woman has a big job and the man's made sacrifices to help support that, or he's been looking after kids, then he's entitled to some kind of compensation. But it should be based on what he would have earned if he hadn't been in that situation, not based on the rich person just giving half of their wealth. You know what I mean? That's what I feel. There's other interesting things that people don't talk about as much, where often you have a family, the husband is the one earning most of the money, the woman's looking after kids more often, and the woman will often be making more of the decisions about spending the money. She's often giving more free range to choose how to spend it and what to spend it on, which in theory she's doing to benefit the family. I would doubt there's that many marriages where they try to police things too much, but that's up to them to decide. I've seen statistics that back this up. I think maybe 80% of all sort of consumer sort of purchases are done by females or decided by females, something like that. So these things should just be taken into account. I'm not saying discrimination doesn't exist, but that's the thing. When you look at it, it makes perfect sense that women are going to choose certain types of jobs, and frequently in marriages they're going to end up, the man can actually get advantage being in a marriage in certain ways. I'm trying to, let me think. Like just silly examples is a single man might feel more obligated to sort of go out on dates and other social activities. Once they're married, if they have a wife at home, it can be sort of an agreement to let him pursue his career more, focus on that, especially if they have children. There's this need, which means they have more costs, so it's not like they're necessarily rich, but there's this need to get a big income. So there's a logic to having the man go out and do as much work as he can to push himself to get as good a job as he can, and the woman's also free to work. She could get as big a job as she wants as well, but it's again that disadvantage of missing parts of work and balancing between plenty of women would want to be married, find a man who's able to earn all that money and have sort of a different role. It's funny to me. I want to talk about a bit with incentives with companies. Like, they don't have an incentive to pay less to women. It doesn't make sense. If women are equally productive to men in whatever industry or area, it makes perfect sense for companies to pay women the same amount. And if they didn't, hypothetically, let's say women are paid only 3/4 as much as men are in a certain area, or even in all areas, right? Rather than worrying even about that's unfair discrimination, which it is, all it takes is any single company to offer women a little bit more than that. They offer women 80% of the men's pay, which you might still say that's still not fair, but just go with me. They would have a monopoly on the female population in terms of work. They would be able to pick, and they would be able to get the best women, which, if they're equally productive, would be they would have the best they would have the best company by far, and they would be able to just skyrocket compared to the other companies, which would fall behind. Any smart company would realize, why would I want to lose an employee, whether they're male or female, when I'm underpaying them, when they're worth as much as these other ones? That competition is naturally going to make everyone, in theory, it should make everyone get paid an equal amount. And again, it's like survival of the fittest. Any company that doesn't do that is going to lag behind, and any company that recognizes early on enough that people deserve to be paid a certain amount will progress. Something else to point out is early jobs, like hundreds of years ago, which were labor intensive, it made sense that they were mostly men that did it, or that it would have made sense for men to get paid more if it's based on physical strength on average. Again, I give an example. Let's say men are paid twice as much as women for certain jobs that involve carrying things and that sort of thing. First off, if there was a woman that was able, let's say there was one woman that was really good and she could do more than the men, she could actually do twice as much as the men, then any company that was paying her only half, she would have some bargaining power. Another company would be in their interest to find out what the other people are getting paid and how much work they're doing, if they could find out. And then they could offer that woman even a little bit more, just 60%, right? And then that company would think, we don't want to lose her. She's twice as productive as even the men. We want to keep her. We'll pay her a bit more. And again, it should even out. Both companies, in theory, should haggle, but they wouldn't pay more than twice what the men were earning. At that point, it would sort of peter out and they'd realize, well, that's how productive she is. That's what should happen. And not just for physical labor or men and women. It's companies don't care about what your gender is or your racial background, anything like that. They care about money, all right? Or at least that's my assumption, where I'm coming from, right? That this is a really good example is in South Africa. I haven't looked at this in detail, but again, I get a lot of this from Thomas Sowell, but I think it's pretty true. During apartheid, right, where the government itself was enforcing racism, or at least discrimination, blacks were not allowed to have certain jobs. They weren't allowed to reach certain levels of jobs. But companies broke the law. In many cases, they broke the law, went behind the government's back or whatever, hired many black people in jobs. I don't know if they paid them the same amount, but they offered the jobs, the black people took the jobs, even though they weren't allowed to, and they gave black people jobs higher than what they were meant to. All of this, I'm not saying it's out of, oh, they were so nice, and isn't it beautiful, like, it was just out of money. It was in their monetary interest to hire black people, or to hire anyone in those positions, including black people. And I think that's just something to be aware of as well. The incentives are not to discriminate. It's in the interest to pay everyone proportional to what they're capable of. Another thing is, if you have a group of people, if, like physical labor, if women were paid less, not because they're women, but because as a result of that, they tend to be physically smaller or whatever. I don't think I need to explain that. It creates an incentive for women to think, I'm not earning as much for this, I should go do something else. And it creates an incentive for people that are big and strong to get into those jobs and do as much work as they can and earn lots of money. This kind of thing, paying people proportional to what they produce, creates incentives for people to go to where they are best able to produce what people are willing to pay for, what people want. Okay, another thing is, governments sometimes try to implement policies to get rid of discrimination, and this sounds really good, but there can be some negative impacts. So for example, let's, again, this is, I don't know the full details of this, but maybe around the 60s, you had a civil rights movement in America. I'm pretty sure some laws were introduced making it more difficult to fire black people, okay? Or that you needed to justify that wasn't discrimination. So, whereas before that, companies, again, what I'm trying to say is companies are always just interested in money. They don't care who's working for them or for what purpose, even if they're racist, even if they're sexist. If there's someone really, really good for their company, they're going to pay as much as they can to get that person, in proportion. But an interesting effect of this law was that some companies stopped hiring unskilled black workers because of the logic that, whereas before they'd be happy to hire an unskilled black worker, and if he didn't work out, they'd fire him, and if he was good, they'd keep him. Same with unskilled white workers. They didn't make a difference. But once this law came in protecting sort of certain black employees from certain things being fired, these companies were now much less likely to hire them for risk that an unskilled black worker may turn out to be bad, and they'd be in a very awkward situation of having to fire him and trying to prove that it wasn't discrimination. So I'm pretty sure when those laws came in America, maybe the 70s, again, I'd have to look at the detail. I'm not an expert on this. I just want people to understand that some of these policies sound nice, but they don't always have the intended consequences. That's what people should be aware of, I think. But yeah, I think the effect was like unemployment for those low-skilled black workers went down. Another thing that I think happened, the unemployment went up. Like less of them were able to get jobs. Again, not because the company's racist or anything, but because they're trying to avoid these laws for fear that they're going to be accused of being racist, when they just want money, they just want productivity. In theory, right? The other thing is, if they have quotas where it's like you need to have this many black people, they're not going to get low-skilled black workers. They're going to only hire black people that they absolutely are really confident they won't have to fire, because they just do not want to be in that situation of firing a black person or having an unproductive black person who they're in an awkward situation. There have been many cases where companies were sued either by, individuals or, for having disproportionately many males in sort of manager positions. I know Sears had a lawsuit going against them for like 10 or 15 or more years. Apparently it cost $20 million to them to deal with. There are many cases where companies can't afford this sort of thing. I actually feel like there's this philosophy that comes about, which is guilty until proven innocent. I think this will come up again later. I think it's so fundamentally wrong. You need to, that's the thing with discrimination. Instead of having a vague, there's this big statistic, the whole world is discriminating or big companies discriminate, that's not helpful. You need to specify which company and what did they do. And in the case of like Sears or some of these other, I think Walmart and a few others, they had a higher proportion of males than females in manager positions, compared to the rest of their employees might have been more 50-50. But, did anyone question like how much experience did those males have compared to the female counterparts? In the case of the Sears one, they eventually turned away the court case because there was no specific examples of women who had been mistreated or had missed out on a job compared to a man who was less qualified. No one had actually been discriminated against. It was just that the men had more experience and were able to go to work more consistently, whatever various reasons, which are completely fair, whatever choices the women had made, or having children, various things, they had less experience. That was the explanation. And I just think if there's discrimination, you need to find evidence. You can't just assume, oh, there's a statistic, discrimination must be the reason. That's the biggest fallacy, the problem that's happening, I think. And it is interesting. It's also true that males completely dominate higher up positions. But again, if you look at experience, you find and choices that people have made and whether they've pursued that kind of direction with their lives, I don't think there is much evidence of discrimination. You get the pattern is that the men have been working for that long and have worked their way up the ranks, whereas the women, there's not as many women in that situation for a variety of reasons that I've sort of mentioned. The main thing is childbirth and other things related to that. Even just the structure, but that's a choice of women. The women that have chosen, to just continuously work have performed equally well to men in the same situation. It'd be really interesting to take men who obviously not necessarily due to childbirth, they can't get pregnant, but maybe they had a child. Men who have taken time off, 2 years off, 3 years off here and there, and compare them to women who have had children and had time off here and there. And you might get a bit more of an even statistic. I'm not saying there's no discrimination, but proving it is trickier than simply a broad statistic, and then it's best to take action against the specific companies and people that there's been discrimination. Something I think I should mention, I know I have a friend who told me when she was in year 10 or something, she got one of the top science marks, or maybe the top mark in science, and her teacher discouraged her from doing chemistry or physics, something like that. I think just because she's a girl, it's not a girl sort of subject, or something like that. And that makes me angry. I hate that. And I hate how in society for hundreds of years, female scientists and female mathematicians in lots of areas, they weren't taken seriously. Part of this could be because of the long-term patterns of structure. And there may have been many cases where, men were working hard at things and figuring out all these maths, and then some women would say, "Oh, that looks cute," and they'd be like, "Oh." So there might be a pattern of like, getting frustrated with women trying to dabble in, but not because they're women, just as a pattern that they hadn't been involved in that so much. So, but this is the thing with discrimination. I think stereotypes are fine as long as you're not like treating it as like a fact. It can't be changed. You have to look at individuals and see, like that's the thing. You could have 5 people apply for a job, and you might see, you might already have some expectations, like, oh, that person, the black person, I don't know, the Asian might be good because Asians, I don't think that matters as long as you then look at the information and allow your perspective to be changed by that. If you're already locked in, that's the problem. Having guesses, again, it's not really prejudice, it's more like a first impression. These things arise because they are patterns in the country, in places. And yeah, it's the best thing though is if you don't even know that stuff, the veil of ignorance. And I think companies, the truth is they just want money. They want someone who's productive, who's going to do the best for their company. And I don't think the government so much needs to step in. If anything, we just need more transparency and, yeah, to call out a specific person if they were racist or sexist and you know it and you have the evidence. Otherwise you just have a vague hatred of everything's against me and it's too hard, and that doesn't help you progress. Alright, so I don't know, maybe that was a bit unstructured. I'll leave it there. Please let me know what you think. I'm not saying I have all the answers. I just think if you talk about the wage gap, please understand that you don't necessarily know the reasons, and there are a large number of completely valid, reasons for why there would be a difference between what men earn, what women earn, even between different cultures. But a lot of it may be based on their choices and other just physical realities of life, not discrimination or someone trying to keep them down or anything like that, anything bad necessarily. So anyway, thanks for watching. Bye.